Hello and welcome to the Albuquerque Museum. We're here today with Dr. Nick Estes and a series of scholars who are going to be discussing themes around the exhibition, 7 Generations of Red Power in New Mexico, which is currently on view online at our museum website, which is cabq.gov/museum. I'm going to introduce Dr. Nick Estes and then hand this panel over to him to introduce everyone else. A citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe, Dr. Nick Estes is an assistant professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. He is a historian, journalist, and host of the Red Nation podcast. He's also the founding editor of Red Media Collective, which publishes books, podcasts, and stories highlighting Indigenous intelligence in all its forms. His writing and research engage decolonization, Indigenous histories, environmental justice, and anti-capitalism. And he's been featured in The Baffler, The Guardian, The Nation, High Country News, Indian Country Today, NBC News, and The Intercept. In 2019, Estes was awarded the Lannan Literary Fellowship for Nonfiction. He is currently a 2020-2021 Freedom Scholar with the Marguerite Casey Foundation and the Group Health Foundation. Estes is the author of the book, Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance. He is the co-author of 2 books coming out in 2021 on police abolition and Indigenous environmental justice. He's also currently working on a book on the history of Red Power. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nick Estes.
Amitakiapi, Nape Chuzapi, Chante Washte. I just want to send a Lakota greeting to everyone who is listening to this panel, but also to my friends and relatives and colleagues on this panel today. I'm recording this conversation in Tiwa lands in what is known as Albuquerque, New Mexico. And it was a great honor to be in collaboration with the Albuquerque Museum, especially people such as Elizabeth Becker, Leslie Kim, my co-creator of this particular exhibit, Rebecca Prinster, as well as Jessica Coyle for setting up this virtual conversation today. And to give a little bit of background on this exhibit, on what it is and what it isn't, and some of the limitations that we encountered in creating this exhibit during COVID-19. So the history of Indigenous resistance in what is now called New Mexico stretches back as far as the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. At that time, Spanish colonizers had enslaved Pueblo people, taken over their lands, and attempted to convert them to Catholicism. In a united effort to expel the Spanish, almost all of the 40 surviving Pueblo groups joined forces to overthrow their invaders. This was the beginning of Red Power as we trace it in this exhibit, the fight to preserve community, culture, and tradition. So over the last 340 years since the Pueblo Revolt, the struggles that Indigenous peoples of New Mexico have engaged in have changed little. They continue to fight for their sovereignty over their lands, freedom from settler violence, and access to resources, even as they face forced sterilizations, child removal, the dangers posed by resource extraction, police violence, and the theft of their traditional homelands. Their story is not unlike that of Indigenous peoples across North America. Native peoples of New Mexico have also engaged in activism outside of the region, at the occupation of Alcatraz in 1969 to 1971, Wounded Knee in 1973, and Standing Rock in 2016. Red Power has been present in New Mexico since the first attempt to exterminate Native peoples from the land, but it was first given a name in 1967 by Clyde Warrior, who was a member of the Ponca tribe in Oklahoma. He was instrumental in founding the National Indian Youth Council, or NIYC, in Gallup, New Mexico in 1961. The organization brought up young leaders to fight for tribal sovereignty, treaty rights, self-determination, and cultural preservation with the urgency befitting of the 1960s. NIYC was influential in the founding of not only the Red Power movement, but what was later known as, the kind of more militant arm of tribal sovereignty. And that story often gets overshadowed by the creation of the American Indian movement in Minneapolis in 1968. But nonetheless, it's important to highlight the origin story of Red Power as originating from these lands and from this particular history. So I want to talk a little bit about the title of the exhibit, which is called Seven Generations of Red Power in New Mexico. Many societies use a concept of seven generations to talk about change in history. And in this particular exhibit, we use Vine Deloria Jr.'s conception of seven generations. To know where you are and know where you've been, and to know where you're going, you must consider 3 generations in the past, 3 generations in the future, and the current generation standing in the middle of that lineage. Your actions today will impact the next 3 generations ahead of you. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist, somebody who was there at the beginning of a lot of these original struggles and formations of the Red Power movement, Dr. Simon J. Ortiz, who is a retired Regents professor at Arizona State University. He's also a writer, poet, editor, author of numerous books, all focused on Indigenous Native community, history, cultural and social identity, political struggles, and resistance. He's also a member of the Acoma Pueblo Nation, a member of the Dayami Hano, or the Eagle Clan, and a former tribal interpreter and first lieutenant governor of Acoma. He's also the father of 3 grown children and a grandfather and a great-grandfather. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Ortiz.
Well, Kawati, Kaitawa Haupa. Hello, how are you? How's everybody? Well, good. Tawa, well, that's good because we all want to be well taken care of by ourselves and well taken care of by the land, which is known in the Acoma language, the Haatsi is the land, and we are all part of it. And our living comes from Haatsi, the land. In the older traditional way, when people believed that they were really part of the earth, we still do, as Akome Hanotitra, as Akoma people who come from the land. When somebody asks, where are we from? We say, from here. We come from here, which is our land, our source. I'm a writer and a poet, and I hope that all of you have read some of my works in poetry and some essay and nonfiction and fiction as well. All of that writing, of course, comes from the oral tradition, in a sense, for all indigenous people in the Americas and other indigenous peoples throughout the whole world. That is, the planet Earth, the Mother Earth, that we know to be our source. And so our knowledge of ourselves, my identity, your identity, our identity, that's where who we are comes from the earth, from the mother, from our source, that we are dependent upon. And we are interdependent in a sense, maybe the primary sense of the word dependency, because it has to do with dependent upon the source of our life, the creation. Whatever we call it in our indigenous languages, we also know it as the deepest and center part of ourselves, and all people really, and all beings in this life source that we know as who we are in terms of our people, our culture, and our life philosophy and system. Well, I want to start with how the value of being who we are as indigenous people has to do with has to do with what we are struggling to maintain ourselves, to be sustainable to ourselves. That is, as people, as living beings, and that has to do with how we, not only Acoma people or Lakota people or Tenetitra, the Navajo Nation and its people, or any other people throughout the Americas who are the original or aboriginal indigenous population of this hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere. Well, our living is dependent upon our beliefs. And so, in terms of our existence, we know ourselves through the cultural guidance that our oral tradition gives us, that we believe that we came from here. As I said just a little while earlier, that our source is the earth, because we came or arose from the earth and from her, the mother provider, the mother source of all our lives. And so to protect it, we have to maintain our sense of responsibility for what it is, as dirt, as soil, as water in the rivers or streams or the ocean, and the rain, that's the liquid, the substance that we know as water, which is essential to our lives. We come from that, and therefore we have to be bound by it. We are responsible and by obligation, to maintain its healthfulness and its crucial nature to our bodies, to our growing, engendering ourselves in next future generations. If we don't take care of ourselves now, then our future generations are not going to be able to be the future generation. Well, when we were discovered, quote unquote, by other people, namely Europeans who came to this land as if it were a new world. It may have been a different people, a different belief system that they came from, but they called us the New World as if we were some kind of savior, which we were not. But of course, we went under circumstances that the Europeans brought upon our discovery by so-called discovery of Christopher Columbus in 1492, in the Caribbean, when he and his crew on an expedition from Spain came into the Americas, and found people or being who were not different, I'm sure, in terms of human appearances than who they were. Christopher Columbus, a Italian who was a sailor who was working for the regime, the royal regime in Spain, and who had hired him or whatever you supported him to sailed his ship across the sea, which is now the Atlantic, and came upon the Americas, which were not known as the Americas, and discovered or found our Hano, our people from the Caribbean. Of course, that's quite a distance from New Mexico. Well, the first peoples were indigenous peoples, obviously. The tribal names are whoever and whatever language they spoke, that they knew themselves by. Just like here at the same time in the 1492, which was centuries and centuries ago, we knew who we were, and the people there in the Caribbean Sea, which is now the Caribbean Sea, was the source of those people there. Well, that was the first time when we were encountered by the Europeans. Time passes, and sometimes we don't know exactly what that means in terms of how fast or how slow. But by 1598, the era next century, from 1490s to 1590s, 1598 was when Juan de Oñate brought the exhibition, not exhibition, but expedition from Mexico into the what is now the American Southwest and New Mexico. This was the first time that Acoma people encountered the different people from Europe. Different people, the white people, Shamotsi, Hanno, the white appearing people. And so then that was the beginning of that European colonization, which of course did not take place immediately, but it took place over time, although some of the foundations of the eventual colonialism and colonization of the indigenous peoples were there, such as religion. The Catholic religion, the Holy Roman Empire, became part of our indigenous ancestors, our great grandmothers and grandfathers. Mishu, Hama, Yunak, Katya, Kashait, many years back into the past. And of course, major changes came, because of really the power of presence that the Europeans had upon the native population, not only in the Caribbean, but eventually into Mexico by 1519 or so. Cortez and the other so-called conquistadors, overcame the native indigenous population, and of course began to, once they came into Mexico and overcame or conquered, quote unquote, the population there of the Aztec people, who were the people inhabiting or were the population of Mexico at that time, and Tenochtitlan, and which later became what is known as Mexico City. And so from there, that was the capital of the New World, in that part of the world, in that part of the Americas. But eventually, they began to look elsewhere, to the south and to the north. And of course, the expeditions to the north, began to take place in the 1500s. It didn't take very long, just over 100 years from discovery in 1492 to 1598, when Juan de Oñate undertook to be the first colonial settler, you might call him, but he known as a conquistador, and he began to wreak many forced changes. He wasn't very long, but then he was only one person. But his expedition that he introduced and brought into our indigenous lives and livelihood made the changes, especially through the religion that I spoke about, the Catholicism. And this became, very much a contentious matter, religion, because as you know, indigenous people depend upon a belief system which is powered by a religious and cultural understanding and the philosophy that's behind that understanding. If our source of life is the earth and the earth mother is, and the concepts of that of our identity is dependent on beliefs in that source, then there are going to be problems when the idea of God, as understood and taught and very forcefully by the priesthood and by the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope and all of the works of that religion, very powerful, impactful force, because it was combined with what was happening in terms of their trade system, their economic power, and what that meant to the rest of the European world. And the Spanish Empire was at the height of its own way of life and way of being. And so the major source of the major result of that source of understanding and way of being for that conquistador and the very rich and wealthy, powerful people back in Europe, in Spain, impacted upon us, so that we began to grow very much powerless and without, say, recourse to much of anything except for ourselves. And Acoma was one of the first targets, because of its location atop this sandstone mesa. It's a large sandstone mesa atop which the pueblo was located. The pueblo, of course, it's a Spanish word, and that was adopted by within even the language system of the Ago Mehanotich, the Acoma people. And so we found ourselves very much regarded as not just tourist items or tourist, whatever you call, to draw the outsiders to us, to you, but because Acoma and the defeat and the war upon the Acoma people, the attack upon the Acoma people, took place almost immediately after Juan de Oñate came into the American Southwest, what is now the American Southwest, and overcame and destroyed the Acoma Pueblo and its people. Over 800 people were massacred or killed outright. And so that was really the first act of resistance, in the North America against the European invasion. And so I think that this is a source of continued you could say agitation or continued inspiration and model, which can still be taken as a way to have people not regard ourselves only as the ones who were overcome by the powers of conquest or powers of Europeans, but also it gives us inspiration and vigor and a goal to actually not only reclaim our land, but really reclaim ourselves in terms mental and intellectual, artistic, and helping what I started with, that to protect our land, our air, our water, and to know that we depend upon the original sources of our belief system to be who we are. Heoti. That is how we are able to claim ourselves, reclaim ourselves and our being. And we may use the word resistance. I know that it seems like a negative word, but it's not. You know, to resist is to resist against powers that are harmful and were and are and may be harmful into the future if we don't do uh, what we need to do in helping ourselves to become the self-sufficient and sustainable people and culture and community that we were. So that's what I'll say for now. Thank you. And I have a statement from Myris that if perhaps I can read it at the end.
Yep.
After the two, Jennifer Marley and Jennifer Denetdale. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ortiz. That was an incredibly powerful and deep history. And of course, there's so much to touch on with what you just said. And so now I want to turn it over to Dr. Jennifer Denetdale, who is a citizen of the Navajo Nation, or Dene. She is a historian and a professor of American Studies, also my colleague, and also my PhD advisor and PhD chair, and the director of the University of New Mexico's Institute for American Indian Research, or IFARE. She has served on the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission for 9 years and served as its chair for 4 years, from 2016 to 2020. She received her PhD in history from Northern Arizona University and is the author of 3 Navajo histories and numerous articles and essays. She is the first Dene to receive a PhD in history. Her areas of expertise include critical Indigenous studies, Indigenous gender and sexuality, Indigenous feminisms, and gender and Dene studies. She has received numerous awards that recognize her scholarship and community advocacy on behalf of Dene and Indigenous women and Indigenous LGBTQI2S relatives. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jennifer Denetdale.
Thank you, Dr. Nick. I'm very pleased to be a part of this panel, to be here with the most distinguished Professor Simon Ortiz and the wonderful Jennifer Marley. I'm really grateful to be a part of this. Jennifer Denetdale and Shia. And so I just introduced myself in the Dene way as the Navajo woman. I'm here in Albuquerque in Tewa territory. And I've been on the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission for 11 years now, I think, and I'm served as a 4-year term as chair, and I was just recently reappointed to the commission, and am now serving as its current chair. And so I'm really proud of that work on behalf of the Navajo Nation. In terms of the exhibit that this panel is a part of, I looked at the exhibit. I'm very pleased with the work that Nick Estes has done on that exhibit, talking about the Red Power and how Indigenous resistance is a tradition. One of the things that we had talked about in terms of my participating on this panel was to talk about border towns. And I grew up in Tohatchee, which is about 20 miles from Gallup, south of Gallup, New Mexico. And so one of our traditions as Dene is always to have to go back and forth across this imaginary boundary between the Navajo Nation and Hispanic and white settlements like Gallup, New Mexico, as well as other border towns like Cuba, New Mexico, Farmington, New Mexico, Winslow, Arizona. And so our work as scholars and as being part of the community, my Navajo community and other Indigenous communities, is to really question those kinds of boundaries that are set up, like Indigenous people only belong on the reservation, when actually all of what we live on is Indigenous lands, and that this movement back and forth between what is called the res and spaces like border towns and urban cities is an imaginary boundary that we every day raise critiques about, because it just doesn't speak about the Indigenous experiences, especially under settler colonialism. I was very young when I began to recognize racism and discrimination, having grown up in and around Gallup, New Mexico. I remember as a child, I was about maybe 10 years old, and my mom and dad coming back from Gallup, and my mom very, very upset because my father had been arrested by the police in Gallup. He'd gotten into a disagreement with one of the businesses where he would go to pay his bill. And the white woman became alarmed at this angry Indian man. And so the police were called. My mom didn't drive, and she had to wait outside of the jail for my dad until he got out. No charges were ever pressed against my father. And while my mom was just so upset about it, I recognize the emotions now of being very proud of my father, that he resisted racism and discrimination, and he called it out, and often had to pay a price for it. And so it wasn't until I went to the University of New Mexico as an undergraduate, and I took, those were the first places that I ever had Native professors, one of them being Lucy Tabahanzo and the late Louis Owens, and being introduced to the works of someone like the distinguished Simon Ortiz. Those were my first experiences with Indigenous writing, Indigenous scholarship. And their words, their language gave me a language to understand and to articulate what has always been Indigenous resistance against incredible settler colonialisms of power, of violence against Indigenous people that continues to this day. And so those early words of my actions and words of my father, and then the inspiration from our Indigenous community and the scholarship of our community-based writers, poets, have always served as an inspiration for me to understand what was happening in these border towns. These border towns where Indigenous people, and especially Navajo people in a place like Gallup, continue to be treated as disempowered subjects, as people who are in the lower echelons of their structure, even though they exist because of Indigenous resources. And so based upon that a growing consciousness about border town and border town violence, I just saw a call for commissioners for the interim commissioner for the Human Rights Commission, and I applied, never really thinking that I would be selected. And I was selected for a 1-year interim position, and was appointed by the Navajo Nation Human Rights Navajo Nation Council, excuse me. And so, the council, the Navajo Nation Human Rights Council was established after a Navajo man, Clint John, was killed by a white police officer in Farmington. And as the exhibit that Nick has put together in his own work, as well as Jennifer's and Simon Ortiz's work, indicates that these places, like these border towns, are just like full of anti-Indianism, and that Indian hating is a tradition in these spaces. I was very young when I was aware of what they call the Choke Cherry Massacre, when 3 white high school Farmington boys tortured and mutilated 3 Navajo men. One of them was married to one of my dad's nieces. My dad was from Fruitland, New Mexico, and I remember the elders, or the parents, my parents and my dad's relatives, sitting at the table and talking about what had happened. And so That's in the 1970s. And then we have here in 2000 and 2021, 2016 was when the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission was established, and it was in response to the killing of Clint John in Farmington by the white police officer. And so the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission is unique because it is the only entity of any Native nation within the United States. And the work is sometimes it can be very refreshing and inspiring because we network and we try to address these issues, these, first of all, these complaints of racism and discrimination that Navajo citizens experience in these border towns and in these urban spaces. But we also have the capability to bring a lawsuit and other kinds of actions against entities that are practicing racism and discrimination against Navajo citizens. The work, it takes and also the protection of sacred sites. For example, we've worked for years trying to protect San Francisco's Peak de Sleep from the kind of desecration that Snowball does there and continues to do. In fact, it is at this moment expanding its parking lot. So that kind of work on behalf of Navajo citizens invokes Indigenous people's rights as well as Diné fundamental law. And Nick mentioned what Sam Vine Deloria talked about in terms of you think ahead, you think 7 generations in terms of always preparing your people for the present and for the future. And so I think about that in terms of the invocation of Diné fundamental law and Diné teachings, and that is a part of the work that we do on behalf of the Navajo Nation. That and as Simon said at the end here, he brings up the point about remembering our original instructions, remembering our relationships to each other. And that is what Diné fundamental law is about as well, is that against these structures of settler violence that we have to deal with and struggle with, we always remember the core principles of who we are as Indigenous peoples and as Diné. And these are the original instructions that are brought to us through prayer, through song, through ceremony, and then become our practices as relations to each other, relations to the Mother Earth, relations to the Father Sky, relations to all beings. And that's what I think is so crucial about the kind of work that Indigenous people, community-based people, our educators, our grandparents do, is because we remember those lessons brought to us by our ancestors. And so thank you very much. I'm pleased to be a part of this panel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jennifer Denetdale. Next, we have Jennifer Marley, who is a PhD student in the American Studies Department at the University of New Mexico. Jennifer entered the program having completed a BA, the double major in Native American Studies and American Studies, in 2019. Her research interests include queer Indigenous studies, Indigenous feminisms, third world feminisms, Indigenous political movements, Marxism, internationalism, environmental studies, critical Indigenous studies, and settler colonialism. Influenced by her upbringing as a citizen of San Ildefonso Pueblo, Jennifer's research explores the unique ways heteropatriarchy has manifested in Pueblo communities and how this shapes and reshapes Pueblo identity and kinship, as well as relationships to the state and other groups. In particular, Jennifer is interested in articulating a Pueblo, Puebla, and Pueblex feminist lens and contributing to the theoretical frameworks Indigenous feminism have produced. So I'll turn it over to Jennifer Marley.
Thank you, Nick. Ubia Gindi, na koe Jennifer Marley, na vitewa koe po na po geoinge ota. I'm from the Pueblo of San Ildefonso, and my grandmother is also from Sia Pueblo. I'm from the Coyote clan. Shrutuna Hanusuta. Excuse me, as I'm still learning my Keres language. I'm going to talk a little bit today about what I'm going to do today is offer a critique first of the art industry and the museum industry and how it has historically played a role in the shaping of Pueblo identity. And then I'm going to talk about how that relates to the current movements we're seeing challenging revisionist history and racist monuments. And finally, I'll end by talking about how the articulations of Pueblo feminism and indigenous feminisms that young organizers and activists have put forth intervene in these conversations. So pardon me as I'm going to be reading a little bit off my notes. But yeah, so I'll start from my perspective. So I come from an art family. Again, my grandmother's from Sia Pueblo and my grandfather's from San Ildefonso Pueblo, where I'm enrolled now. And from the late 70s through the mid 90s, they maintained a status of notoriety within the Indian art world, participating in, of course, the Indian market, Indian market, and the Herd Show for a number of years. And during that time, they acquired a significant amount of wealth. And what I'm interested in thinking about is how the art industry and the museum industry actually function as an extractive industry with the extraction of not only native art and culture, but of native wealth and life. So I ask, what was the cost of being represented in the upper echelons of the art world for my family? I recall my grandmother and aunts being especially patient with tourists and spectators who would pry for sensitive cultural information or make patronizing or infantilizing remarks about our family, and at worst treat us like living artifacts that exist for their entertainment, as if us existing in our pueblos were like a living museum. The livelihood of our family depended on making these pottery sales, even if it meant participating in the commodification of our culture and performing cultural authenticity to appease the white gaze that sought the exotic. I would come to find out that family friends who are among the many buyers of my grandmother's pottery and those who we welcomed into our home for feast days made their fortunes as oil Mongols, museum directors, and scientists at Los Alamos National Labs. Those who were directly implicated and even made their living off of our death and exploitation of our lands. The fact that my mother grew up relatively wealthy during the height of my grandparents' career contrasted against the fact that I grew up relatively impoverished, which I didn't realize until my adulthood, I think highlights the extractive nature of the Indian art industry. The very consumers of our art don't care to see our suffering, only our feathers and our beautiful creations. The very consumers of our the distance that my grandparents' career created between us and our Pueblo core values is apparent. Our relationship to money and our understanding of wealth would become transformed by the capitalist mindset that the art industry had instilled. And so what I challenge the audience to do is to look beyond the superficial charm and beauty of New Mexico and instead consider what the cost of producing and maintaining such a rich and beautiful regional culture is, and how it's implicated in racial capitalism and global imperialism. So meanwhile, as you know, New Mexico continues to be known for its production of culture, Indigenous people continue to have the lowest quality of life here, suffering the highest rates of poverty, addiction, violence, both on and off the reservation, as Dr. Denetdale just mentioned in depth, while the wealthy continue to live in leisure on stolen lands, enjoying outdoor attractions, native art, and culture. So I ask, what role do aesthetics, visual culture, and literature in New Mexico play in reinforcing the inevitability of Indigenous disappearance? So much of New Mexico's visual culture makes a spectacle of Indigenous art and culture, yet Native people themselves are denied access to their own lands, be it in the art mecca of Santa Fe or at the site of the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos. I argue that New Mexico's economy is actually dependent on the art and tourism industry alongside gas, oil, and the extraction of uranium. while it is simultaneously dependent on Indigenous disappearance and Indigenous death. So I want to kind of go over briefly the history of the Indian art industry and its relation to racist monuments and celebrations. Many people might be familiar with my involvement in the protest to abolish the racist entrada. So I want to talk about the origins of the racist entrada in its relation to the museum industry. So it was in 1922 that the Indian Fair, which would come to be known later as the Swai Indian Market, was created by the Museum of New Mexico as a part of the Santa Fe Fiesta celebration, a celebration that included the notorious celebration of genocide known as the Entrada, which is a reenactment that depicted a revisionist account of the brutal reconquest of Santa Fe by Don Diego de Vargas. It came to be known as the Bloodless Reconquest, which is anything but true, being that there at the site of the plaza, over 80 Pueblo warriors who participated in the Pueblo Revolt were hung soon after, and their wives and children then distributed to de Vargas's men as slaves. The Museum of New Mexico and School of American Research board members were entirely non-Native and Western educated. These outsiders, led by the much heralded grave robber Edgar Lee Hewitt, added elements to the Entrada and the museum to make it more appealing to white tourists and visitors to Santa Fe. Hewitt, a well-known anthropologist, was known for unlawfully excavating remains and artifacts from holy Pueblo sites and even trespassing into Pueblo residential homes without consent. Hewitt and his ilk also romanticized the colonial Spanish era through the creation of the contemporary Entrada with images of Catholic and military glory from a bygone era. According to Swaya's own website, in 1919, museum director Lee Hewitt had revived the fiesta as an annual celebration to help promote tourism. His inclusion in the Indian Fair and the fiesta pageant was reminiscent of the World Fairs, and in particular, the San Diego Exposition's anthropological exhibits and the Santa Fe Railway's living exhibition titled The Painted Desert. This particular World Fair, mind you, placed Pueblo Indians in human zoos as exhibits. And I remember seeing those pictures of potters from my Pueblo, San Ildefonso, in these man-made zoos with these like fake mud homes, and I just couldn't believe that that's not more talked about in terms of our history and our involvement in the art industry. And I also think that those snapshots are reminiscent of Pueblo people selling their crafts under the portal at the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe, being photographed by tourists to capture this time period, marking the beginning of the tourism industry. To this day, Native artists are made to sit on the ground under that portal to sell their crafts, to keep intact this nostalgic image, once again attempting to relegate Indigenous people to the past, and only in the past are they able to exist. Meanwhile, walking vendors on the Santa Fe Plaza are subjected to police violence, jail time, and fines for not paying that hefty fee to sit under the portal as a living artifact, or refusing to sell their wares to the predatory museums and galleries lining the plaza, who refuse to pay full price for Native art, but then mark it up to 3 times its purchase price. Museums, galleries, and pawn shops are the physical manifestations of these predatory industries that have always depended on Native suffering, impoverishment, desperation, and death to sustain themselves. Yet many of these artists hold on to their pride and dignity and actively engage in the refusal to protect culturally sensitive information and avert the degrading gaze of those who consume their art. What is often overlooked, however, is the experiences, attitudes, and feelings of these Native artisans, even as we critique the institutions that facilitate their exploitation. So I think it's this refusal that Native artists and Native people in general are now engaging in that's actually calling on us to remember these very racist roots of the art, tourism, and museum industry in New Mexico. And those industries are absolutely responsible for creating a lot of the narratives that are popular in New Mexico today that glorify the genocide of Pueblo people, the Spanish colonial violence, and later US occupation today. So as I entered the university at UNM, I came into contact with the Red Nation. And the very first event I went to was a screening of a film called Nuclear Savage, which was about the way atomic bombs were tested by the indigenous Marshallese people at Bikini Atoll. And I immediately made the connection between the establishment and creation of the first atomic bomb on my ancestral lands. And so very soon, I would come to realize that this was a long ongoing movement. I was not new to it, and neither were any of us, but I would come to learn later that the Entrada had been being protested since at least 1980, and that there was precedent for this type of Pueblo activism. And I was excited to learn more about it and to continue these traditions of resistance myself. So one of the very first campaigns that the Red Nation created was the campaign to instill Indigenous Peoples Day, followed by the campaign to abolish UNM's racist seal. And we understood that movement as being in tandem with these efforts nationally, whether it be the abolition of the Confederate flag or the abolition of Harvard's racist seal, which depicted the seal of a slave-owning family. And this would actually lead to a series of campaigns that were also focused on the abolition of racist imagery that reinforces the celebration of genocide here. So after our victory with the abolition of the seal, which only barely this year is it actually being removed, and this began in 2015, we would see that campaign spill over to the campaign to abolish the Entrada, which we first got involved with in 2016, after people who were formerly a part of the reenactment themselves had decided to protest after, realizing what it was actually doing. And then from that, we would see nationwide people contesting these racist monuments. This year, we saw the removal of 2 statues of Oñate, known for his, as Dr. Ortiz just mentioned, notorious crimes against the people of Acoma. And he was actually one of the only conquistadors to be taken back to Spain in shackles and charged by the Spanish crown for his brutality. And only in New Mexico here is he celebrated. And it's because of these narratives that have been reinforced by the museum and the art industry historically. And in response to this pushback against revisionist history and anti-Indian racism, we actually saw pushback from that from people who identify as Hispano, people who identify with Spanish conquest. And so we also understand that this pushback exists in relation to the broader white supremacist violence that we're now seeing take place all throughout the US. And it is especially intensified, within the past few years, or at least become more visible, right? So we hear these Nazis, right, chant the phrase blood and soil, and you will not replace us. And scholars have pointed out, such as Jody Bird, that you will not replace us is the rallying cry of settler imperialists who move to displace Indigenous people, who destroy us in order to replace us. In addition to its roots in the terrorization of Black life, white supremacy has always operated according to the genocidal logic of destroy to replace. And we know that this anti-Black racism that we've seen manifest in the multiple police shootings just within the past year alone, and the genocide of Indigenous existence, also known as settler colonialism, are the twin pillars of white supremacy. And they're at the heart of these gatherings that we're seeing today and that are being threatened at the inauguration. And they're indeed the heart of settler nationalism. So there's these undeniable parallels to what we're seeing at the national level with the mobilization of these white supremacists and those who are reacting to the removal of racist Spanish monuments that celebrate genocide. And there's a reason why these efforts to abolish white supremacist holidays like Columbus Day, Thanksgiving, monuments, statues, and university seals have been met with this type of opposition. That's because these monuments, these reenactments, and these symbols represent ideological attachments to the status quo. And that status quo in the US is white supremacy. And as we saw this past summer horrifically, its proponents are willing to kill to preserve it. During the Abolish the Racist Seal campaign, we experienced numerous attacks from people that claimed we were erasing their history. And what we continue to see today is what exactly happens when these white supremacists or Hispano nationalists decide to kill and harm and harass to keep intact these symbols that are so precious to them that in some cases they even liken to our own ceremonies as Pueblo people or Indigenous people. So now I'm going to shift gears a little and I'm wrapping up to talk about Pueblo feminism, to talk about land, and to talk about how we envision generative possibilities moving forward. So an example of how the tourism industry operates today is by the creation of these resorts on sacred land. So I'm going to be talking about Ojo Caliente, which is a world famous resort and spa located north of Espanola, at a place which was once known as Posti Owinge, derived from the word Postiwi, meaning green, in reference to the color of the rocks around the hot springs there, and in reference to a Pueblo cultural hero and deity who was invoked during the Pueblo Revolt. So there's examples of places like Ojo Caliente, and then also Los Alamos National Labs, which was established in the Jemez Mountains near the Bandelier National Monument, are cliff dwellings. They have even been contaminated since. So there's this very clear link between the tourism industry and what is made into tourist attractions and the theft of land and desecration of land and life. So I'm going to finish up here and just talk real briefly about our articulation of Pueblo feminism. So it's undeniable that these recent movements against these celebrations of genocide have been led by young Pueblo women and other Indigenous women. And so the Pueblo Feminist Caucus, who I'm a proud co-founder of, we center the experiences of Native youth and Native non-men because of the way historically heteropatriarchy has been instilled in our cultures to erase our feminine deities and to erase the roles of women historically. And I'm just going to read a little excerpt from one of our very first articulations of Pueblo feminism here. And it says, traditionally, caretaking was and still is the responsibility of many family members within our larger networks of kin, not limited to taking care of children, but we caretake our elders, our partners, we caretake the seeds we plant, we caretake the land, we caretake our animal relatives, and we caretake our sacred sites. Queer Indigenous feminism asks us to expand our ideas about what counts as caretaking and who is a caretaker. It doesn't matter what your gender is. It doesn't matter if you speak your language fluently. What matters is how you act. Are you a good relative? That's the only question queer Indigenous feminists ask ourselves and ask of our comrades. So I leave the audience today with two questions. Exhibits like this one highlight our precious histories of resistance and remind us that these traditions are not only relegated to the past, but ongoing today. So what are the generative possibilities for museums to empower Native people and our traditions of resistance in a place like New Mexico, where historically they've served to uphold violent revisionist history and the glorification of genocide? I mean this question seriously because although I'm very critical of the museum, I see this exhibit as an example of countering that. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jen. You covered a lot of ground. So, unfortunately, Morris Chino, who was invited to participate in this panel, wasn't able to make it due to some unforeseen circumstances. So, I'm going to read his bio, and then Dr. Simon Ortiz is going to read a short statement on behalf of Morris Chino. So, Morris Chino is of the Eagle Sun clan at Acoma Pueblo. He was born in Albuquerque in 1954, attended the Grants New Mexico High School and New Mexico State University. His career has been as a forest firefighter, a teacher, a miner, illustrator, art consultant, full-time painter, and when time permits, a potter. And also he has a piece on the Pueblo Revolt that's actually featured in the exhibit itself. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Simon Ortiz to read a statement on his behalf.
Okay, thank you. I shall read this on behalf of Anawe, my nephew, Maris Chino. Greetings, everyone, and Happy New Year. I'm honored to be here to help speak about Indigenous resistance. I appreciate the venue the Albuquerque Museum has provided through the exhibit 7 Generations of Red Power in New Mexico. I like that title. It means the people were never acquiescent to the violent subjugation that happened at the hands of the so-called Spanish conquistadors. It means that the people have always held an inherent sacred power to retain our land, culture, and religious beliefs. It means that the people were never conquered. We never became dark-skinned minor mirror images of the Spanish invaders. Our resistance is the reason we are still here. It is important to note that the resistance to the Spanish invasion here in New Mexico began almost immediately. It was a mere 6 months after the butcher Juan de Oñate crossed what today is the Rio Grande in southern New Mexico that violent confrontation with the Spanish began. My culture, my Acoma people from earlier confrontations knew the education, the situation was, and that they're to be free, that our lives, our culture, and our very existence were in mortal danger. The people rose to violent resistance. There was no other alternative. And for defending the land and the people, Ako was nearly destroyed in a battle that raged 3 days in the bitter winter of 1599. The massacre of over 800 Acoma's men, women, and children was meant as a lesson for other indigenous city-states. Juan de Oñate, may he stay in hell where he belongs, was not the only Spanish who came to the northern frontier to what is now New Mexico. There were others who cast greedy eyes on the new land. Coronado, among others, had arrived here before Oñate and wreaked havoc among the peoples and the city-states along the Rio Grande. They were never benign explorers. Their invasion was always about greed for the land and resources, and greed for the very souls of the people. The Catholic Church is culpable. The Church was never accepted, has never accepted its role in the attempted genocide of the people. Cultural and religious genocide is every bit as devastating as blood spilt from swords, cannons, muskets, and attacked dogs trained to eat human flesh. During the dark years, 1591 to 1628, two-thirds of the indigenous people in New Mexico perished from Spanish violence. And of the over 90 original indigenous city-states, only 19 have survived to this day. The tragedy of genocide here in the American Southwest was the same as in Central and South America, differing only in sheer scale. Entire tribes and cultures were vanished forever. Our lives on the reservation were affected by many of the government programs meant to erase us later on after the Spanish. McCarty Day School, one of the governmental schools at Acoma, worked as its brainwashing on our young minds. We pledged allegiance to the American flag and sang the Star Spangled Banner with all our young hearts. On Friday afternoons, we were required to learn the Catholic catechism from nuns dressed in traditional gowns and habits. We were, as young children, we were affected by Indian Relocations Act of the 1950s. My cousins, with their mother and father, moved to Cleveland, Ohio. Their father, after learning the welding trade, moved the family back to Acoma. They were the fortunate ones. They were rooted firmly to the land. The intent to remove Indian people from their homelands and become part of the mainstream of American society work. And sadly, some never returned, and some even today return only occasionally strangers in their own homeland. In 1972, I attended Haskell Indian Junior College. The AIM takeover at Wounded Knee had just happened, and some of the activists were laying low on campus. I remember talking to Larry Anderson. He spoke quietly about revolution. I listened, but didn't have much, but I wasn't much affected by what was happening in Indian country. I wonder about that now. I wonder what mean made me not want to act. In 1992, something happened that changed my life. I read a story in the newspaper of a statue to Juan de Oñate. The story affected me at the gut level. The rage of intergenerational repression rose up inside of me. I could not sit by and do nothing. I began to write letters, which were largely ineffective. They seemingly changed nothing. I hadn't made any difference. The first statue of Oñate went up in Alcalde, New Mexico, northern part of the state. The change came within myself. I began to organize. I founded the Southwest Indigenous Alliance. I had no idea what I was doing, but I learned from other activists who helped me as I went along. And this is a timeline of some of the SWIAs, Southwest Alliance, Indigenous Alliance. In 1994, he founded Southwest Indigenous Alliance, started to organize symposiums and conferences. 2003, first action for SWIA to protest Jornada monument at Albuquerque Museum. That was the point was the statue of Juan de Oñate, the so-called conquistador. 2004, presented foot of power, a hand-sculpted clay foot representing the right foot of Acoma warriors after the Battle of Acoma in 1599. He gave it as a donation to Mayor Marty Chavez of the city of Albuquerque. Maris is an artist and sculptor. 2004, Suaya makes a trip to southern Mexico, Chiapas, in solidarity with the Zapatista movement, commemorating the 10-year anniversary of the 1994 Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, Mexico. 2005, protest at the Albuquerque Museum on Veterans Day to protest Conquistador war, the Conquistador war machine in solidarity with Veterans for Peace. 2005 and 2006, visited tribal leaders throughout New Mexico, Navajo Nation, and Hopi Nation to seek tribal support to oppose Albuquerque Tricentennial. 2005, protest at Albuquerque Public Library. It was the first major confrontation with John Hauser, sculptor of Oñate Equestrian Monument in El Paso, Texas, and Hispanic Cultural Preservation League, which is in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. 2004, a protest at the Albuquerque Conservatives Convention Center to oppose the visit of Spain's Duke of Albuquerque, Albuquerque, as we called it at Acoma, to New Mexico from Spain in preparation for Albuquerque's tricentennial. We were outnumbered by the police by 3 times. 2007, protest at the El Paso airport with others from Isleta Pueblo del Sur tribe, which is in El Paso, east of the city of El Paso, and Chicano allies from El Paso, Texas. So those are the things that items that Myris wanted me to present on his behalf. Thank you. And thank you to His Honor Myris.
Thanks so much, Dr. Simon Ortiz, for reading that. I just want to reflect briefly on some of the things that were brought up in this discussion, because it was very wide-ranging. And first of all, it's to say that this exhibit, because of the certain limitations of having a virtual exhibit, we couldn't include everything. And that's why I invited all of these panelists, is to fill in those gaps and to expand and extrapolate on some of the things that were in there and some of the things that weren't in there. And I really appreciate that Maris provided a timeline of all of those events, because it's incredibly important. Another thing that Jennifer Marley touched on is the function and the role of public art as well as public education in the form of museums. And one of the most potent forms of history, as it's told in the mainstream kind of media, but also in mainstream education, is something that archaeologist Michael Wilcox calls terminal narratives, which are the obsession with death, disappearance, and the absence of indigenous people, rather than their continued visible presence and challenge to colonialism, which I think each of the speakers really spoke to. And the most obvious example of this tendency are historical models that assign blame for the mass killing of indigenous people to invisible forces such as diseases or germs, right? And I think in this particular moment in time, we can look to what we're currently facing as the pandemic, and look to how narrative shifts that the Red Power movement, proliferated, help us understand this particular moment. And just to kind of reflect and build on what everyone in this panel has said so far, Native nations have been the hardest hit by the coronavirus, as we all know, especially in the Southwest and especially in New Mexico. The Navajo Nation, whose lands helped make the United States the world's largest oil producer, now has faced some of the worst rates of infection and death, not only compared to other states, but to entire countries. Almost 30% of its reservation population lives without running water, and about 10% lives without electricity. While coal from the Navajo Nation fuels power plants, and the water from its river soaks golf courses in Phoenix, Arizona. And the United States, as Jennifer Marley brought up, created the first nuclear bomb on a sacred Tewa Mesa with uranium mined from Navajo lands, poisoning generations of people. So for the Navajo and Pueblo people in this state, the real pandemic is, and always has been, resource colonization. And what we now know, as modern day police violence also has its roots, as Jennifer Marley pointed out, and as well as Dr. Simon Ortiz pointed out. It's important to note that the first frontier police in the United States were the scalp hunters recruited into Indian country to murder Apaches in the 1840s and the 1850s. Churches in Santa Fe once ran the scalps of Apaches up on their flagpoles. And this, for my people, from my perspective as a Dakota, Lakota person, in Minnesota, settlers collected scalp bounties on Dakota men, women, and children in 1862. Frontier newspapers advertised land for sale alongside rewards for bloody, quote unquote, redskins. The violence of the settler has always been understood as productive, progressive, and thus lawful, and thus correct, right? And so we can understand how not only art, but also how public history can reinforce those narratives, but also creates a space where we can challenge those narratives, right? And we see how those narratives have been challenged, and I think each presenter has brought up the various ways, and the changing of sports mascots, the toppling of colonizer statues, but that happened not just because it was the right thing to do, or people's minds had been changed. People in power who had as Mars pointed out, had decades to change these things, didn't do so, but it came at the behest of movements led by Indigenous people. So I think that's incredibly important to remember and to reflect upon. I have several questions, and we don't have a lot of time, but I do want to ask the first question to Dr. Jennifer Denetdale. I would like you to briefly explain, because my first encounter with the Red Power movement actually came through the legacy of Larry Casus, and also reading the Farmington Report, which was, detailed the Chokecherry massacres. It was a response to that as well. And so I was wondering if you could briefly touch upon the importance of a figure like Larry Casus and his role in Red Power in the past, but also in the struggles today for Indigenous people.
I grew up in Tohatchi, New Mexico, which is maybe, 8-9 miles from Larry Casus's home community of Mexican Springs. I was 11 or 12 years old when Larry and Robert Nakadene took the mayor of Gallup hostage, because that was the only thing that they saw that was finally left to do in their objections to the way that Gallup treated its Indigenous and primarily its Navajo people in terms of just keeping a alcohol-soaked environment, which always resulted in dead Indians and dead Navajos. And so I was just a young person, 11 or 12, and I was aware of the shooting of Larry Casus by Gallup police. I was aware of the Navajo community becoming incensed at the treatment of Larry's body in the aftermath of his killing. and just the widespread protests that happened throughout the schools during that time. But I was very young, and I didn't understand what was happening at that time. And it really was the Kiva Club, I think, that reminded us, the indigenous community, the Navajo community, of Larry's sacrifice. They held several memorials, several teach-ins to remind us of Larry Kasusa's sacrifice on behalf of his people. And I think that resistance and that standing up for Indigenous people, which took Larry's life, has been a reminder to our people that these struggles are more than 500 years old, and that Indigenous people continue to be here and to continue to resist in multiple ways. And so after that, I also became aware, after I started reading about what had happened in Gallup, and I knew about what had happened in Farmington because of my father's relatives who had talked about it at the kitchen table. I then became aware of John Redhouse's work and found John to be just this incredible, brilliant person who worked relentlessly on behalf of his people. At one time becoming a community organizer and advocating on behalf of his people, refusing the hate against Indigenous people and Navajo people in Farmington in the aftermath of what they call the Choke Cherry Massacre, to then read John's work and just see what an incredible strategist he is, how brilliant he is, and that their work and their mindset and their energy was always about resistance to the settler and the settlers' insistence that we are beholden to them and that we have nothing to offer. And so I became inspired by those readings, and I actually found John's email and emailed him. And after that, we began to correspond, and he sent me more of his work and his readings. And so that's how I became more acquainted or began to realize a little bit more about the struggles during the Red Power movement, and then becoming aware of present day struggles of Indigenous people, particularly in border towns, meeting Nick and Melanie Yazzie and their work through the Red Nation, which was also motivated by another brutal mutilation and torture of two Navajo men, Key Thompson and Allison Gorman, who were murdered here in Albuquerque. And so the work continues, inspiration and the determination that we don't just stand by, and we haven't just stood by, that resistance takes different kinds of there's layers of resistance that continues to the present.
Thank you. And the second question that I have is for Dr. Simon Ortiz. You were an active participant in the Red Power movement in its early days here in Albuquerque and in the Southwest. And in fact, John Redhouse, who Dr. Jennifer Denetdale just mentioned, pointed out that he was misidentified in one of the pictures that we have in the exhibit, and that it's actually you who are featured in the exhibit. And it was when you were in the offices of the National Indian Youth Council as an editor for Americans Before Columbus, which was the NAYC newsletter at the time. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about your role in NAYC and the Red Power movement during that particular time.
Well, I was with NIYC from 1970 onward. Of course, I knew about NIYC, National Indian Youth Council, before, because you mentioned Clyde Warrior's name a while ago. And he was actually the leader. He was from Oklahoma. And he was, I think, maybe during his college years that NIYC, formed. And I was in high school by then. I didn't know much about it until really in Gallup when he was forming. And I had just newly finished high school in May of 1960. And so I had gone to the Gallup Indian ceremonial, which used to take place in Gallup. And it was sponsored by the Gallup and the mayor and the city fathers and so forth. And of course, it was really an exploitation of Native American or indigenous culture. And they would have performances done to show what Indian expression, at the time, of course, the term was very strong and still is Indian in this or Indian that and Indian stereotypes, and of course that was what the focus was upon, the so-called honoring of Indian people and culture and art and so forth, but it was actually money making, and Gallup, New Mexico is a border town, a big border town, where many of the indigenous peoples locally, the Zuni Pueblo Reservation is to the south of Gallup, and of course, the northern and western and eastern borders of the city of Gallup and McKinley County, which is Gallup is the main city within that area. It's surrounded by Tenet, the Navajo Nation people, and of course east of there is Ago or Acoma, about 75 miles or so to the east. And so the Gallup Indian ceremony was a money-making thing that in non-indigenous people, would put together annually. Since when, and who knows when it would end. Well, actually, there was a protest for years against that kind of exploitation of a Native American ceremonial and events and a proper respecting and honoring of indigenous peoples. And of course, New Mexico is originally nothing but the indigenous people until later in 1590s and onward. There were other people who came to there to be a part of that Gallup Indian ceremony when it began. Well, in 1960s and 1970s was after I had finished high school and went to college. I first worked for the uranium mining and refining industry. Right out of high school, there was a job. And we, as indigenous peoples in the area, especially Pueblos and the Navajo Nation people, men and boys were hired easily because of we didn't have much skills, except some years in high school and grade school and so forth. Of course, we spoke English and understood, the time and working, and we put our backs and arms and hands and feet to work, as cheap labor. And so we were exploited for what physical powers we had. And so I knew firsthand, the oppression, that wage labor is. And on indigenous land, Laguna Pueblo had been forced to open the Jack Pile uranium mine, the first open pit and the biggest open pit uranium mine on Laguna Pueblo land. Mm-hmm. Laguna Pueblo is just right next to east of our border is Kauai, the lake people, or Laguna, which is also, of course, lake, Laguna, Spanish. And so we knew that oppression. And so when I joined later the NIYC, which was headquartered at that time in Albuquerque, New Mexico, I had these firsthand experience of working for the man, Kerr McGee, Kermac refinery in Ambrosia Lake, which is part or originally part of the Navajo Nation, and even of course the Navajo people were employed there. People from Pruitt, which is right next to Milan, which is next to Grant, New Mexico, in the McKinney County and Valencia County. The cheap labor was all indigenous people, and of course Mexican American people in San Rafael and San Mateo and in Grant itself. And so we were all part of that swarm or swamp of exploitable land and resources, along with the uranium. And so when I went to work with NIYC, I was the editor of the newspaper ABC, Americans Before Columbus. Because I knew the people, and of course I was somewhat well experienced from not only being in college at Fort Lewis in Durango, Colorado, and then later joined the Army because I was disgusted with college, because it was teaching me nothing except what the American education felt I should learn to be not just cheap labor, but a cheap office worker, maybe, or something. I wanted to be a chemist, at that time, many years ago. And in fact, I even majored in chemistry at Fort Lewis College, and later on at no, that was it. 3 semesters of college for me, and I was disgusted with college, and so I left and joined something even more dumber, which was the United States Army. And after I came back from the discharge from the Army, I was I went to begin college again at UNM, University of New Mexico. Anyway, being a newspaper editor, really, with this activist organization, NIYC, National Indian Youth Council, I think gave me a real look, because we worked with indigenous peoples through the pueblos in like Tesuque Pueblo, which was undergoing a land issue where this outside corporation was wanting to use some of the land for its golf course, and also at Cochiti Pueblo, where a lake was built, and the Great Western was a housing development, and the Pueblo people did not want to just be standing by as the federal government, which is BI, Bureau of Indian Affairs, was going to sign the papers. And so they came to us as NIYC, and we held protests and prevented, to some degree, just American corporations to take over the land. And there was other land issues in Arizona, and NIYC had worked with the fishing rights struggle up in Washington State, before that, and so we had this foreknowledge and understanding of what people had to do to resist, really, and to offer advice to tribal leaders and the community elders. And so I would say that my work at that time was the generation of much of my poetry, much of my writing at that time as a journalist, and so it was from there that I began to see myself as a writer. I wrote before that, but I felt that my experience with an activist organization, NIYC, was very essential to what later on I focused most of my career on over the past 50 or so years, and have published, like I said in my bio, cultural, social, political identity, which I think folk is faced or presented through what I would call resistance efforts. So that's what I would I offer as a reply to you, Nick, and I'm glad that you're here. You know, when I say I'm glad you're here, that you're here in Pueblo land and country, our home. You are welcome. And I hope you continue to be here to help with our struggle.
Thank you for that really wonderful history, Dr. Simon Ortiz. And also thank you for welcoming me to these homelands as somebody who's a guest. So we're running out of time, but I do have a final question for Jennifer. And Jennifer Marley, since she asked it, I'm going to ask her to answer it. So part of the goal of this exhibit, and I think Simon really explained, gave a really great explanation of this, but Indigenous movements are sites of knowledge production, and they inspire art, and they produce kind of new knowledges, right? But oftentimes they're not seen or credited with those kinds of features or those kinds of histories, or pushing art in a certain way, or public histories in a certain way. And the goal of this exhibit was to feature Red Power movements, and to really think critically about what they mean and their impact on our present kind of moment. And so when I think about public art, I think about decolonizing public art and public spaces. I think of a mural that was painted several years ago by the Taos Pueblo artist Lynette Houses in what is now in downtown Ogopoge, or what is now known as Santa Fe. And I wanted to reflect on that. I wanted you to reflect on that a little bit about how she's Taos Pueblo and Apache. So I wanted you to reflect on that, and that meaning and the significance of reclaiming that space and that history, because the mural itself actually represents, you're represented in it. Your friend and relative Justine Teba is represented in it as well. But how does it actually reflect a larger kind of continuum of Indigenous resistance? And what can places like the Albuquerque Museum do to be more accountable to Indigenous communities and Indigenous stories?
Sure. So I'll give a little bit of background to how I first saw the mural. So it was actually being unveiled on the same day that the Red Nation planned a march through the Santa Fe Plaza, and this was during Indian Market. And we chose that particular weekend to disrupt that space, which, like, let's be honest, Indian Market is for a white, wealthy audience. I mentioned earlier that, before, we had squares and stuff, these tourists would just walk with thousands of dollars in cash on them through Indian Market. And so we chose that day knowing there'd be a mass gathering of people and intentionally wanting to disrupt this event that SWAIA puts on, and that really, like, the city of Santa Fe depends on for economic sustainability. And what we did is we opened with prayer, and we opened with dances from our youth, and then we silently marched through Indian Market, and we stopped at different sites and talked about the significance of these sites, because throughout the plaza, there's just so much deep and very, very violent history there. So we talked about the site I mentioned where I was arrested, where Pueblo warriors were hung, where gallows stood. We talked about some of the racist monuments throughout that area. We talked about the cathedral and the fact that it was built atop a shrine, which the Tewa name for that land is derived from Ogapogeowinge, white shell water place, or white shell watering place. And we wanted to take it as a moment to counteract all the narratives that the plaza itself and that Indian Market creates. And so at the very end of the march, we realized that we happened to just so end right as a reception nearby our ending spot, like just a few meters away from our ending spot, was being held, and this was to unveil that mural. And so we just ended up taking the march into it, unannounced. And we gave some final words in our final speeches there. And it was really cool because they actually opened up, they gave us the mic and they opened up that space to us, even though we showed up unannounced. And I think it was an example of exactly how things should be in that moment. And it's so rare that you see something like that happen in a place like Santa Fe, where something like a gallery opening or the unveiling of a piece of art is something very exclusive. And, you might otherwise be violently policed if you were to show up with a big group unannounced. But in this case, they gave us the mic, they gave us that visibility and that time to speak our truth. And actually, Patuch was there. And that was really cool because he also, for us, embodied these long legacies of Pueblo resistance and activism. And we really admire him and his work he's done around challenging nuclear colonialism. And so that's when I first saw the mural. And I think that's when a lot of us all saw that mural in person. And to me, it just, symbolized, as we were trying to do with the march, like the reclamation of Ogapo Gewinge, the reclamation of that space. And, there, instead of a mural glorifying a conquistador, you saw this mural celebrating the resistance of Pueblo women, just again, less than a mile from the spot where I and others were brutalized, this mural now sits. And just right across from the cathedral too, at the IAIA gift shop area. And so that was really awesome. And I think that moving forward, there's a lot of, I think there's a really intense psychological impact that art and Pueblo people being represented in a way that isn't just where we're relegated to the past is I think that psychological impact is very important moving forward. I think that Pueblo people themselves sometimes have a hard time accepting the resistance we had to carry out in order to get free, in order to preserve our lifeways. And I just really hope that things like that mural and things like these marches and these reclamation of spaces can remind us that those traditions of resistance are a part of our traditions. They're just as precious. And hopefully we can start to see ourselves in a way that isn't just informed by the anthropological narratives that say Pueblos were so docile and we're the civilized ones. Because, we're here because of our righteous rage and the way we've stood up over time to these celebrations of genocide and genocide itself.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Pilamea Ota, big thanks, many thanks to everyone for joining and sharing your thoughts this evening. I want to encourage anyone who's listening or viewing right now to go to the Albuquerque Museum website and check out the exhibit. There is a place for comments at the end. If you feel like there's something that you want to share, if you yourself were a participant in any of these movements, there's a place to share your story at the end of the exhibit. And we encourage, like I said, this isn't the only narrative. This isn't the only, exhibit. This isn't the final word on any of this. This is just opening a conversation. And because of, COVID-19 restrictions, we weren't able to include the kinds of things that we would in a physical exhibit. But nonetheless, I do want to thank, again, our panelists, Dr. Simon J. Ortiz, Dr. Jennifer Denetdale, Jennifer Marley, and with us in spirit, Mars Chino, and also everyone at the Albuquerque Museum for hosting this discussion, as well as hosting these stories and these narratives about the Red Power movement in New Mexico. So Wopila Tanka for everyone for joining, and hopefully I'll see some of you in person sometime soon.
Thank you, Nick.